Well, I see we have a few attendees, so we're about a minute and a half past the top of the hour. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the economics webinar for July 2021. This webinar will actually be a little bit different than some of the material that we've provided in the past. In the past, we've given, we've done common calculations in the fertilizer world, so a little bit math heavy. I know we share a lot of research, so some statistics and some data, some conversations about nutrient cycles, how nutrients move within the ecosystem. How do we better manage those nutrient inputs to maximize uptake by the crop, minimize environmental impact? I'm trying to think of, I think we've done some market conversations to a limited degree. We've had some external contributors that talk about different issues related to agriculture. Today's going to be a little bit different. We do that sort of intentionally because we like to keep it fresh for you as an audience. I'm comfortable doing just about any kind of a conversation. It's just whether or not you're willing to listen to me for an hour is always the challenge. Today's going to be a demonstration of an app that we just released through our economics website. To begin, I'm going to show you how to locate this if you haven't had a chance to download it, if you haven't happened to have caught some of the press releases that have been out there in the trade world. Obviously, I'm an Apple person. Don't hold that against me if you're an Android person. The bulk of my media life is stored in an Apple framework or a platform. So all of my digital media, whether it's movies, podcasts, music is all owned by Tim Cook and the group at Apple. I started down that path many years ago. And once you get started down the path, it's really hard to deviate from it. So I'm going to be showing you the experience in an Apple platform. As far as app functionality and what you're going to see, it's going to be identical in an Android platform. The only difference will be when you go to do your actual search within the store. I think you should be able to enter in the same information, but all you need to go into is do a search, and we're going to type in economics, and remember the funny spelling. The only one that should pop up when you type in the full term economics would be economics by Nutrien. Just hit that, and that's ultimately the one that you're going to be downloading. It's pretty easy to recognize. It's got the nice yellow background, which is nice on your desktop, or like I keep it referring to it as a desktop, but on your home screen on your phone or your home screen on your iPad. It's easy to see. That was intentional. So download that, and that'll get you right into the functioning app, and that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our day today. In fact, all of our day today is going to be spent walking through some of the features of the app, trying to get in front of what potential questions you might have as a user, and just sharing a little bit of the functionality. Now, the one thing I will say about the functionality of the app is it's identical to the tools that we have on our website. So if you're a frequent user of the tools, this will just be a little bit of a more user-friendly environment to access those tools. The math behind them is identical. Any future updates that we make to the website will also be ported over to the app. We do have some plans in the not too distant future to update some of the functionality. It's not going to result in a tremendous change in your user experience, but it is going to add things like for the nutrient removal calculator, we're working very hard to add sulfur. Again, like I always say, and you'll probably hear me say this a couple of times during this conversation, the biggest limitation to our ability to put information on the website or the app is the availability of the data. We try as agronomists, as employees of Nutrien, do our best to beat the bushes to find as much usable information as we possibly can, but there's always a data limitation that we run up against. That'll be very clear when I start talking about the nutrient ROI calculator. Interestingly enough, I don't think we've actually done a webinar in this series where we talk about the tools themselves. So this is maybe fortuitous that we have this conversation today. I'm going to start with the ones that I think are the more easily accessible to you as a user. Pretty straightforward in their functionality, but just to give you an idea of how this environment works and how easy, in my humble opinion, I really think that the user experience in the app is better than what we have on the website, because it's driven by your finger. When you're working through a website, unless you happen to have a touch screen laptop or a touchscreen desktop, you're pretty much working with a mouse and you're clicking through. This seems to be a little bit more intuitive for me as a user. You may have a different perspective, but for me, this seems like an easier environment to navigate when I'm using the tools. So I'm going to start with Rainfall Tracker. Interesting thing about this tool is it's an easy way for a user, and I'm just typing in my zip code. You could type in, or you could actually use, if you have access, and you'd have to obviously provide authority to the app to utilize your GPS location. I'll show you one of those as well here in a moment. But for this point, I'm just going to type in my zip code, and then I hit next. I wish I had a way to show you where I was on the screen, but you really can't see it. But if you look to the bottom right where you have your keypad or your keyboard, there's a blue next. If I hit the next, then it's going to scroll to my next option selection. For simple use for this conversation, I'm just going to go back to June 2021. So we're going back about a month and a half. We actually do have access to the limited amount of data that we have for today. I tend to be one that I want to see the last full day of information. That's just my preference. It's just the way I think. And then we hit next, and then I've got all of the entry that is required for me to do capture a summary of how much rainfall has fallen within this particular. Now I'm obviously operating this at a zip code. You think about geographic distribution and the size of a zip code. Zip codes can be fairly large geographically. Maybe not the best way to be accessing the tool, but it's just a simple way for me to at least show you some functionality here right off the top. We're going to go back in and change that here in a moment. Between the dates of June 1, 2021 and July 19, 2021, just how much rainfall has occurred within this zip code. Now it's actually going to do a point source sampling. It's not going to integrate the average within the zip code. It's going to say, okay, 44691. I think we actually show it on the website. It actually defaults to a specific location within that zip that's pulling this data from. Again, if you're living in an area that the zip code represents a fairly large geographic area, the values that are being returned may not accurately represent the rainfall that you've technically received within your immediate area. So when I go back and I show you how to do the editing and allow it to use your point source location information, we do have high resolution data that we're capturing. So you are going to get different information, even if you're just a couple of miles away from another point source sampling. So just keep that in mind when using specifically this tool. GDD doesn't vary all that much. There is some variability, but air temperature doesn't vary all that dramatically across a fairly large geographic distance. Rainfall can, you all know, if you have some experience in the farming community and had rain gauges out in fields, just trying to get some general information of rainfall or precipitation amounts in an area, that can vary from field to field, and even if those fields are adjacent. So higher resolution information is probably going to be something that you're going to be accessing a little bit more frequently than how I'm demonstrating the tool here, just using zip code. But what we have here, and I suspect everybody can see my cursor, that may or may not be true because you're accessing this. I'm accessing this through my iPad, so I doubt you can. But we have the green bars is the weekly rainfall amount that's occurring within that 7-day period. So from June 1 to June 8, we got just under an inch of rain. If we go to June 15 to June 22, we only got 0.3 of an inch of rain, but the cumulative rainfall total over that 3-week period is 2.27. So we're actually giving you what the cumulative amount is over the entirety of the time scale that you entered, but we're also giving you weekly increments so that you can, again, it's just a way to look at what your rainfall pattern has looked like. Let me go back now. One important feature about this is if you hit home at the top left, it's going to take you back to the main menu screen. I get frustrated when I do that because I have to go back through and go back through the entirety of the rainfall tracker, make all my selections. But if you look at the top right, you have this edit feature. So if you hit edit, it brings you back to the selections that you've already entered. So I'm going to go into the year location. All I have to do is hit it with my finger. And I'm going to click that little bitty thing to the right, the green circle that looks like a map feature. I'm going to hit the map feature, and I'm going to say set location. And I can, so it actually, I can't remember if this is, I'm assuming this is actually Apple Maps that it's using. So I live in Worcester. for security reasons. That's a joke. I'm not going to show you my actual location. I'm going to set this. This is just off of 250, basically straight west of my current location. I'm going to set that as a location. Then I'm going to recalculate, and I'm going to see, did that make any difference in the rainfall amount? And as you can tell, it did. It's still in the same zip, but because of the resolution of the rainfall information that we actually capture, that we have access to through our weather supplier, this particular location got a couple inches less of actual rainfall. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was 10.53 or somewhere in that magnitude for the previous one. Obviously, I wasn't paying super close attention, but at this particular location, we've only got 8.2 inches of rainfall over that same time period. Just to share with you what we're hoping to update this feature with in the future. We've had this conversation multiple times. It's just always tricky trying to figure out how we do this cost effectively. I think it would be really, really valuable to be able to look at historic information so I can see how this particular period compares to like a 5, 10, 20-year average. Just to give you an idea, there's certain things that we could potentially do with that. One could possibly develop yield prediction models. It may not be terribly perfect or terribly accurate, but it may give us an idea, or give you an idea as a user, as to what your yield trajectory expectation would be based upon the environmental conditions that you're experiencing within this given growing season, at least relative to the average. So we'll be looking for some future functionality changes with this. I don't know what the time frame for that would be. But I'm hopeful we'll be able to get that done here within the calendar year. But I hate to make any promises if I can't deliver on them. So I'm not going to make any firm promises today. So that's the rainfall tracker. And just for interest, we're going to scroll this back out to a little bit larger of a geography. Let's scroll, I don't know, let's pick Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Beautiful area. Great for pheasant hunting if you like to chase pheasants in the fall, winter period. We're going to set that as our location. We're going to use that same time schedule, June 1 to July 19, and we're going to hit calculate again. And this particular location, yeah, all the reports that you read, it's been dry out there. It has been in that month and a half, a little over a month and a half, 3 inches of rain has fallen. The bulk of it was the week of July 6th to July 13th. Over 2/3 of the rain that they've received fell within that week. But again, you get to see an idea of this functionality. The other thing that you can do with this, if you're not just interested in seeing it in this format, you can actually send the results to, you can text it to someone, you can send it through an email. And if you're wanting to capture information or you're wanting to share information with other folks, it's a very simple way to do that. So that's the rainfall tracker, fairly simple functionality. I go to that quite frequently when folks call me and ask about crop conditions, which doesn't happen all that frequently, but occasionally I'll get a question like, well, hold on, let me run to my rainfall tracker. In the past, I had to go to the web. I could actually do that on my iPad as well. But the functionality of this specific tool using the app is pretty slick, because then I can just simply go in. I don't have to know their zip. They just tell me where they're located. I can find it on the map, set that as my point of interest, and then run through my calculations. The growing degree days calculator's got a little bit more functionality, but essentially it's the same. The only difference is now I have to start selecting crops or pests. We do have a few pests in here if you're using this as a scouting tool. And essentially what growing degree days is the heat unit accumulation within a specific time period. Again, it's very crop specific or pest specific, because different crops have different heat unit ranges at which they're going to actually be accumulating biomass. So if you're typing in corn or soybeans, it's obviously going to be the same algorithm, same equation. But if you start talking about wheat, alfalfa, barley, you're going to start using different minimum temperatures, different maximum temperatures. And so you do have to define what specific crop you're interested in, or what specific pest you're interested in. I do know as functionality, we've already got cotton. It just hasn't been updated. So again, be looking for the next iteration of this tool. Cotton will be present. I think we're also going to add peanuts. Peanuts adds another level of complexity because some of the newer GDD models that are used for peanuts also have a moisture estimate involved. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to accommodate that. possibly if we could integrate that with the rainfall tracker. I can't promise that today, but it's certainly something that we're looking at, because we're always looking at ways to expand the tools and expand the offerings that we're providing you as a potential user. Living where I live, we grow a lot of corn. We also grow a fair amount of wheat. I'm going to just go ahead and just for something different, we're going to go to somewhere close to Findlay, Ohio. We're going to set that as my location. And then I'm going to set my dates. I'm going to go back a little bit earlier. So let's go back to April 15. Well, let's make it April 20. Let's say I planted my corn on April 20, and I want to see how many heat units have been accumulated between the planting date and the current date. And pretty slick, pretty simple, just like the rainfall tracker. Enter in my information for the crop I'm interested in. It gives me a cumulative GDD. Again, it'd be really nice to be able to show you some historical perspective across that same time scale. Again, hopefully that's something that we'll be able to offer in future rollouts or future updates of the specific app and tool. But pretty straightforward. I know I get questions about GDDs every so often. I know I did a lot as an academic. So when we were thinking about tools to develop for the website, and then ultimately when it ended up in the app that you're seeing today, this is one that I thought would be very useful for folks. If you're getting that question, the nice thing about the app now, you can be standing out in the field using your finger on your phone or your iPad, if you happen to carry either one of those out to the field, do a quick calculation if you're talking to a customer, and be able to tell them, okay, here's where our GDDs are. If you have some physiological information, we've tinkered with that as well. Should we be providing some physiological information? If you're at this point, GDD accumulation, where would this crop be in its maturity? And the problem with that is you start having to make this much more complicated. You have to start making consideration for hybrid, what the relative maturity of those hybrids are. Could be done. It's just not something that we've done to date. So I think those two tools, functionality almost identical, a little bit of a change with GDD because you do have to define the crop. But as far as your ability to manipulate, identify location, set the date parameters, very straightforward, very easy to do. And again, you could send those results if you're interested. You see at the bottom of the screen. So let's talk about the more involved one. We're going to save the more involved one for last. I'm going to focus on nutrient removal calculator. Again, if you visited the tools online, we're giving you the same optionality. Again, my contention is this interface is just a little bit slicker, a little bit easier to use. I'm going to pick a crop that we don't grow much of in the state of Ohio. Let's just pick something fun. Let's pick dry beans. That's certainly more of a Western crop. A little bit further north. So let's say unit of measure, we're going to say imperial. We do give you the option. If you are a user in Canada or anywhere outside of the US where the common unit of measure is metric, we do give you that option. Where I reside, the way my mind thinks, I tend to think in an imperial fashion. So we're going to use imperial. And for dry beans, and I strangely enough, I picked the one that we're working on that had a little bit of a problem. So let me pick oats. So when you hit yield, if you notice, it's hard to see. It's hard to see on my screen. It's easy to see in the app, but when I look at my computer screen where I'm displaying this for you as a viewer of this webinar, it gives you the units in the yield. And the units of yield will tell you exactly how you need to be entering in this information. So we've got yield in bushels per acre. So if you're going to be entering oats yield, we need to make that in bushels per acre. Let's just assume it's 40. You hit next, you hit calculate. It's got the nice little infographic, shows you it's working in the background. And this data matches exactly what we have on the website. It gives you what your removal is. So you've got your nutrient of interest. At this point, we've only got N, P2O5, which is phosphorus, and K2O, which is potassium. Again, future iterations, we will be adding sulfur. We're tinkering with the idea of adding micronutrients as well. Again, the only challenge and the real limitation to our ability to provide a lot more information is the availability of data from a publication. It doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed publication. We pull a lot of information from what we call gray literature, which would be an extension publication from a university or some other research entity that has a dearth of information that they publish somewhere out there. That's our primary limitation. I would love to be able to show for every crop what's the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, boron, copper, iron. Again, the only limitation is the availability of that data to us as users. Once you move right of the nutrient, we have the removal. So that's how much is being removed. If I'm just harvesting the grain in pounds per acre, which you see at the top, so that 40 bushels, the results are in pounds per acre. So I'm removing 31 pounds of nitrogen, 11 pounds of P2O5, 8 pounds of K2O. If you move further to the right, the uptake is the amount of nutrient that was taken up to achieve that yield level. So that 40 bushel oat crop is taking up 43 pounds of nitrogen, 18 pounds of phosphorus, and 45 pounds of potassium. Pretty straightforward. Again, don't hit home. We're going to go back and we're going to change it to a different crop. Let's just make it wheat. So wheat grain. Let's change my, and all I'm driving with this now, once you have it entered, is my finger. You just tap on, like if I tap on imperial or if I tap on yield, I can go through there and really quickly change. If I change the crop and it resulted in a change of unit of measure requirement, that would be displayed here. Again, when you use the tool, this will be very apparent, but it tells you what units you need to be supplying as far as what number needs to go in there to make sure that the tool functions properly. Where I live, 90 bushel wheat is pretty easy to achieve. And then here we go. So I've got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. I've got something different because for certain crops, we do have different options. So if I'm removing both the grain and then I'm going to come back and harvest the straw, which is fairly common here in Ohio, how much nutrient am I going to be removing with that sort of a harvest operation compared to if it's just grain only? So the removal is going to be, the assumption is it's just the grain only. And the uptake again is there as well. So that 90 bushel crop is going to be, if I'm just harvesting grain, 135 pounds of nitrogen is going out of the field, 54 pounds of P2O5, 31 pounds of K2O. If I'm removing the straw, I'm removing a lot of the nitrogen. This isn't a perfect estimate because you're not going to be able to put that header completely on the ground and harvest that straw right, or harvest that crop right at the soil level. There's going to be some straw that's going to be left in the field. So it isn't perfect, but it gives you a general idea of how much more nutrient you're removing, specifically things like potassium. That's the one that we often talk about if we're talking about, say, corn, and we have the opportunity to go deliver some of that stover to a cellulosic ethanol facility. It doesn't necessarily impact nitrogen or phosphorus removal. Phosphorus is certainly one that's impacted the least. But if I'm harvesting that stover, or if in this instance, if I'm harvesting that straw, I'm taking a lot more potassium out of the field that would normally have just been returned back into the soil. So just something for those major grain crops where we do have stover or straw removal, just to give you an idea of the difference in nutrient removal if I am removing the straw or the stover out of the field. It's a lot different system than just a grain only system. I'm going to edit one more time. I'm going to select a different crop. Let's see. Grain sorghum, not something, I don't think we grow any acres. I've never seen it in the state of Ohio. It doesn't mean it's not here. It just means I haven't seen it. So certainly something I see a lot more out west. Let's say we're harvesting 140 bushel grain sorghum, and then we hit calculate. And this must have been one of those that had a challenge. We had a couple of issues. They're all being changed right now. The nice thing is, if there is a user error, I think we flagged all of them. When we update this, you'll never have to see it. It'll update in the background and update it and take care of some of those issues. I just am a really bad selector. I select the ones that we did have some issues with. Let's just go corn just for one more. We'll make it imperial. And then we'll change. So let's make it a 250 bushel crop. Then we're going to hit calculate. And there's our removal. Again, if you're taking off the stover, you're removing a lot more potassium than if you're just removing grain. Nitrogen's pretty impacted, but it's really going to be that potassium that's really going to see the impact. Removal uptake, just like we've shown in the past. Again, this matches exactly what we have on the website. Pretty useful little tool. The one thing the comment that I constantly get back about the tools that we have on this particular app and what we have on the website, it seems like Even with the short release that we've had, the short release window we've had for the app, I've gotten some feedback. What people most appreciated about it is the folks out west and the folks in the southeast that do grow beyond our traditional Midwestern crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, spring wheat, things of that nature, durum wheat. We do have a lot more crop offerings than most tools that provide nutrient removal estimates. That's only going to continue to grow. Again, the only limitation is the availability of the data to us. So if you do reside in those areas where you do grow a lot of fruits and veggie crops, be coming back with some frequency. As soon as we find someone has published nutrient removal estimates, we'll be adding them to the calculator, and they'll be updating in the background. It won't be something that you'll have to do yourself as a user. So that's the nutrient removal calculator. 3 very useful tools, very broad geographic offerings. It's really why I saved the nutrient ROI calculator for last. Number one, it's the most sophisticated tool that we have, but it's also the one that has the greatest geographic limitation. We rely very heavily, well, not just heavily, solely upon published information from which to build these models. So again, my only limitation to our ability to build a model for a crop or a crop within a certain geography is the availability of a crop response model that is published, whether it's in an extension publication or a peer-reviewed publication. That's my only limitation. But I'll go ahead and demo this. Fewer crop offerings. I would love to have this for every crop that we grow on the North American continent and beyond. Again, the primary limitation is availability of data from which to build an economic model from. Maybe one day this economics webinar would be the appropriate forum to do that. Actually walk you through as a user, if you're using these tools and you want to have a better understanding of just how we build the functionality that you see. I was the one that developed most of these tools. The agronomist on staff now, we're trying to expand this as broad as we possibly can. We have added some crops in the last couple of years. I know these models inside and out. Fairly complicated, but I think they can present it in such a fashion that gives you a better understanding of how they actually function. Very straightforward. I'm going to pick soybeans for this particular example. Now, the question that you're immediately going to have is Robert, now for soybeans, this doesn't really apply. So let me go back and choose corn. You're going to say, Robert, why don't you have a nitrogen model? Again, the biggest limitation is the availability of the crop response model. Most of the land-grant universities, in the way that they generate nitrogen recommendations, doesn't actually result in a crop response model that I could actually use. Now, that isn't true of the Midwest. Most of the Midwestern states utilize an approach that we could actually easily build a crop response model from, because of the philosophy that they employ when it comes to making nitrogen recommendations. I won't bore you with the specifics as to how that differs from the traditional way that we do phosphorus and potassium recs and the data that we collect. But I could build one for the Midwestern states. We still have some data availability limitations that limits our capacity to do that. My hope is at one point in the hopefully not too distant future, I don't really want to make any promises on this one, I would love to have a nitrogen response model as well. It would essentially emulate what the MRTN models that exist, that's what it would look like. We could maybe tinker with the functionality a little bit. As a former academic, I was involved pretty heavily with the group that developed the MRTN approach that's employed almost exclusively across the Midwest. I'm not here to say that it's the optimum or the best way to generate a recommendation. Like I often tell folks, on average, it is the best way, but that on average term makes people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable as well. But in the absence of another approach, it's the best method that we have at our disposal today. There are alternatives to the MRTN, but it's also the easiest one for me to build a model from. So that's why nitrogen isn't present. It's not a lack of a desire or effort on our part. It's still a lack of data availability that sort of has limited our capacity to add nitrogen to this particular model. But stay tuned. Hopefully that's something that we can change in the next couple of years. So I've got soybeans. I can do phosphorus or potassium. And again, you can pick one or the other. I'm going to just do phosphorus for today. You notice at the very bottom of the screen, you have your scroll with your finger of what particular location you want to use. And again, for those of you who reside outside of the Midwest, I apologize. The reason this is so heavily populated by Midwestern states is they're the ones that have published their crop response models. And it's from that I can build an economic model. I'm going to select Indiana for no particular reason. I just feel like being a Hoosier today. We're going to say 5 to 10 pounds. Again, as far as functionality, we tinkered with the idea of making this more discrete. So you can just type in what your soil test level is. That changes the way my model functions. It actually made it a little bit more difficult for me in developing the model. If I predefine what your range limits are, it makes it easier for me on the programming side. It also keeps the user interface simple. And we're all about trying to keep this as simple as possible. The question came up yesterday I had a phone call with an individual asking about, well, is this Malik 3 or Bray P1 or Olson? At the typical ranges that we're dealing with within the functionality of the models that are provided out there in the space, at the low end, there's not much of a divergence. Olson would be the one that would diverge pretty dramatically from Malik and Bray at a lower soil test range, but Malik and Bray are very similar at the low end of the soil test. As you move out further, you start to see some divergence between those two estimates. So we haven't really tried to make it more complicated and say if this is a Bray, if this is a Malik. If you look at things like the tri-state publications here that represent Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, the new recommendations are based upon Malik 3, and there wasn't a substantial change in what their range sets were. So that's sort of the justification why we don't include that. Again, moving forward, if we get more states, and the other thing is most of the states that we are displaying in the model today are Malik or Bray. We don't have a single one, to my knowledge. Did Nebraska show up on there? Nebraska would be the only one that might offer an Olson phosphorus extraction method. But moving forward, if we think it's important that we change that and add that additional functionality, we will. It's just going to be another cell that you're going to have to enter as a user. I'm going to use 5 to 10, and then we're going to hit next, and then it's going to ask for what your acreage is. I think in 1 acre, you can enter this for a quarter if you're living out west. If you're really big agriculture, you can enter this for a section. Notice we ask you what the unit is. This is the number of acres. I always think in terms of per acre, so it makes it easier for me. That's just the way I think. Enter in what your yield potential is. We could have a long, lengthy conversation about how do you estimate what your true yield potential is. We're going to keep it simple. Take a number that you've actually hit, maybe add 5% and say, okay, this is what my yield potential is. That does influence what you would see out of the model output. I'll change that here in a moment just to illustrate that for you. And then we're going to go to nutrient analysis. So I hit next. We're using phosphorus, so let's just assume it's 1152.0. The question I often get is, why don't you just provide a drop-down box and give us the most typical phosphorus fertilizer materials? Well, the reason being not everybody has access to MAP, DAP, or TSP, triple superphosphate. We wanted to make this flexible enough that if someone was actually using a blend, they could enter in triple 19, triple 13, and actually run this model as well. So that's why we actually ask you as the user what the actual nutrient analysis is when you're running this particular model. Again, initially we had the drop down, then I started getting pushback that, well, you don't have a large enough data set for me to be using specifically in certain areas where they do a lot more blending. I suspect that everybody blends. So I just said, well, we can deal with that very simply. We'll just allow you to define that as the user. Now, I don't live in the nutrient price world. We have sales professionals that do. I honestly don't know what the most recent price of phosphate is. Don't assault me with comments later that Robert used a very poor assumption. He was either overestimating or underestimating. I sort of stay out of that argument until you start using these tools, because number one, I don't want to know what the current market is unless I'm asked a specific question and asked to give a presentation on it. It's just not the world I live in. I live in the world of crop models and things of that nature. So I'm going to assume $600 a ton. That may or may not represent reality, but for the sake of me running the model, that's the assumption that I'm going to work from today. I haven't looked at the commodity markets in the last couple of days, and soybeans has been as high as 1480 in the last 2 months and as low as like 1240. So I don't know where we are today. I just haven't looked. I've been doing some other things. Let's just assume $13 a bushel soybeans. Again, that may or may not be representative of reality. If you don't like my numbers, you have access to the tool. You can run your own analysis, and that may be more appropriate for your operation and the prices that you as a retailer are providing to your customers, or the prices that you have access to as a farmer from your retailer. Allow you some level of flexibility. There is a base limit that you cannot go below. So if I'm going to use whatever the land grant university recommendation, if you're using tri-state, again, it's not perfect. It's going to be somewhere in that 55 pounds per acre. Part of the reason it's not perfect is because it's not discrete. I'm using incremented soil test levels to define what my crop response looks like. So this 55, it's also not adjusted for yield potential. So I'm taking an average, and I think I'm using 200 bushel. Oh, I just realized I'm working in soybeans. So 250 bushel soybeans would be really darn good. So let's go back and change that. That's how easy that was to go back and change. I'm going to still use the land grant university 55 bushels. And cost of ammonia, the reason we have to have this is because I'm using MAP. It's got nitrogen in it. I have to extract that nitrogen value from that so I can get a dollar per pound of phosphate price in order for me to run my economic model. Again, I don't know what anhydrous is today. I know it's higher than it's been, so I'm just going to assume $700 a ton. I'm going to hit next, and then I can hit calculate, and it's going to run my model. And based upon all of that information, that's a fairly low soil test. I picked that specifically because I knew it would be fairly responsive. If you're in that 5 to 10 pound range of soil test P, if you put on that 55 pound per acre rate, you cannot go below that. I'll show you that when I go back here in a moment. You cannot go below what the university recommendations are. It messes up my model dramatically. I've tinkered with that as functionality. But then it would really force me to go to a discrete model, and that just makes my life a lot more difficult as a modeler. If you added that 55, you're going to be adding 106 pounds of actual P2O5, or of actual material. That would be MAP that you're going to be supplying. On average, you're going to be increasing your yield by 8 bushels at the yield level that you've set. Your crop is going to be removing 41 pounds based upon the yield that you entered in. And the value of the phosphate that you're removing is $23 per acre. So that's all of the information. At the end of the day, the only one that you're really interested in is the top one, and that's what your net return on average would be increased by if you fertilize this crop with the rate of fertilizer recommended by the land grant university recommendation. Let me go back and just change one thing. So let me change my yield potential. Let's say I'm in a little bit more difficult of a growing environment. So let's make that 40. And then I can just hit calculate again. What do you notice about what happened to your increased net return? The lower your yield potential, the lower the yield impact, because the yield impact is on a percentage basis. So if you recall, at that 60 bushel yield, if that was my yield potential, that translated to an 8 bushel per acre average response. That's the other thing about this model. Is based upon average response. I'm not doing this like you typically see on commercials. The best one is like the diet products. You can lose up to 80 pounds per acre, but then they'll have at the bottom is this is an atypical result. That's not what I'm showing you here. I'm showing you average. So if you notice, increase your net return by an average. I could show you data where your net return would actually be higher than that. I can show you instances when it's lower. I am truly working with an average response. So for this 40 bushels, as opposed to an 8 bushel typical response, it's only 5. So my economic payback from the investment is going to be lower. All right. So it is a function of what your yield potential is. I just wanted to demonstrate that. And then one more thing, just to show you this is an honest model. I'm going to show you the 15 to 20. Everything else has remained the same. Actually, let me go in and change this back to 60. And this is just how easy this is to change. I really love the functionality of this. It's so much more user-friendly than the website. So if your soil test level's in that 15 to 20 range, your crop response is much lower. Now on average, you're only going to be changing yield at that 60 bushel yield potential by 2 bushels. Okay, so you went from $79 return to 16. I'm operating from the average. So as you change what your soil test level is, it's going to change what your average net return is going to be. If you're well above, so if just for visual, if you're well above the crop responsive range, for Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, once you start getting above 40, you're actually getting into a recommendation. If you noticed, the desired fertilizer recommendation down here went to 0. So if I'm using the land grant, it's going to be 0. Now, what's interesting is I actually give you a net return value. Does anybody see where that comes from? It actually matches that very bottom $23 per acre. So by not fertilizing, I'm capitalizing upon a previous application of fertilizer. And so that's why this is a positive $23. I'm not increasing yield. I'm not changing yield at all. If you notice, I didn't add any fertilizer. I didn't change yield. But one of the challenges with most economic models that are based upon an agronomic model is you're penalized the first year if it doesn't result in crop response. And the question I've always asked, well, if I'm over fertilizing, as long as we're not doing dramatically, right? Because then we start getting into some environmental issues. But if I'm slightly over fertilizing, which is many of our crop response or our crop recommendations do that specifically at the low end to build up your soil test. If I've built my soil test up to that 40 part per million, I paid a penalty when I was doing the over application, but I never had an opportunity to take advantage of that economically. This is built into this model. Okay, so that's why that $23 is there. Again, someday, maybe if I want to, if there's enough interest, I'll give a presentation of exactly how these models function, and just demonstrate that for the group. So let me just change this to a slightly lower one because I want to. That's still 9. And again, part of the reason I'm doing this is just to show you how easy this is to navigate. It's very simple. There we go. I wanted to get one that was negative. So this is, if you're following land grant university recommendations, once you get to a certain soil test level, the recommendations default to crop removal. And I don't know where I'm at on the scale of this particular one. But here's that thing that I was talking about. I'm supplying fertilizer. It doesn't result in an increase in productivity. I'm incurring a negative $6 return on that investment, but there's a little asterisk up there. And part of the reason the asterisk exists is it's telling you, okay, you're maintaining the current soil test level by supplying a crop removal rate of nutrient or something that approaches crop removal rate. You are building up your soil test by supplying slightly more nutrient than is actually being removed. All right. So this -6, while it may be a negative this year, in subsequent years, if I'm following this fertilization strategy, I'm going to be capitalizing on that investment because my recommendation theoretically should be slightly lower in future years. Now, it depends on what your rate of applications are. But again, I wanted to show you this is an honest model and show you a little bit of the functionality of how this actually works. I'm going to go back to edit. We're going to change crops completely. Let's go with cotton. Let's move down to the southeast. Let's do potassium. I've got Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina. Let's do Tennessee. And essentially, all of the states that you see represented are states that are predominated by coastal plain soils. And that's where a lot of our cotton is grown. So I'm going to select Tennessee. That's a really low soil test. Let's make it 75 to 100. Let's assume 2 bales. So if you notice the units, again, I don't know if you can see them very well on your screen, but it's in pounds per acre. So I'm going to say 2 bales, 2 bale cotton. So we're going to say 1,000. I need to change this to 0, this to 0, and this to 60 because that's our typical potassium source. Let's see, crop nutrient price, let's make it 550. Again, I don't know if that represents reality today or not. Price per pound, let's make it 85 cents. We're going to use the recommended rate of fertilizer, which is 55. Run the model. On average, if you supplied 92 pounds of potassium chloride, which is going to supplement 55 pounds of K2O, you're going to be returning $73 per acre to the bottom line for that operation, given the assumptions that I entered into the model. So let's go in and change this to 800 pounds. So let's just make it a bale and a half, so 750. Let's run the calculation. What happens to your net return? It decreases. So it is a function of what your yield potential is. One thing that I wanted to illustrate very clearly for you today. Very simple to use. Again, I contend this is a heck of a lot easier to utilize than the website. I do see a Q&A. So those are, yeah, that is, we have actually done presentations on this. So the question that was asked is there some advantage in building soil test levels? And there is, and the real advantage is this. My sales professionals don't like it when I say this, but it's the agronomic truth. Let's say last fall, and I'm at least getting anecdotal evidence that this was occurring. So take it for what it's worth. Last fall, in some geographies, based upon sales information, we suspect that farmers were putting on a slightly higher rate of potassium in some areas than what they would normally be supplying based upon the given economic conditions at the time. And I've made this statement in many public forums. Those farmers and retailers that are supplying those farmers that made that decision look like geniuses today, given where commodity prices have gone and where input prices have gone. So the question is, was there an advantage to those individuals taking advantage of what they saw as a good buyer's market and oversupplying a nutrient beyond what they would have expected a typical crop response? And the answer from an agronomic perspective is simply yes, because what happens is if I'm oversupplying potassium specifically, number one, I picked potassium for a very specific reason. There's no known environmental consequence associated with over-application of potassium. The other thing is very little potassium has the potential for being lost, depending upon how it's managed. I'm not going to dig into all of that today. But as long as I'm not surface supplying it and leaving it exposed on that soil surface for long periods of time, and I'm not operating on a very coarse textured soil, the potassium that I put on there is not likely going to be going anywhere other than into the soil and being available for subsequent crops. So theoretically, and this doesn't always work, theoretically, I should be building my soil test level. What is the value in building a soil test level? Well, the value is when I don't like market conditions with regard to fertilizer price, if my soil test level is very high, when I say very high, that doesn't mean it's got to be 300 pounds beyond what the critical level that is established by the land grant. Let's just say it's 50 pounds above what has been established by the university as far as a critical. I have the option of not supplying fertilizer. So I bought that based upon previous investments. So therein lies the value of building a soil test. Now, if you start talking about phosphorus, there's going to be some limitations to your ability to do that in specific areas. It certainly would apply in the state of Ohio if you're talking about the Lake Erie watershed, because we actually have legislation in place that will dictate what the rate of application will be. But for nutrients like potassium, and that's really the best illustration we have, there is value in building soil test, and the value that it gives to you as a farmer is the flexibility to not supply nutrient when you think that the price of the fertilizer material is high. The challenge that I often follow that statement up with is you don't know what's going to happen to fertilizer prices in the future. And that's true of most of the decisions that we make in agriculture. What I think is a good decision today, the best illustration I have is planting date. You know what, it's April 20. I know it's a little bit early here in Northern Ohio, but I'm going to risk it. I've looked at the 7-day forecast. I don't see the risk of cold, wet weather moving in. I'm going to go ahead and plant. Well, you won't know for a couple of weeks whether or not that was a good or a bad decision. And what's going to dictate whether or not it was a good or a bad decision was whether or not that weather forecast was accurate. I always tried to push planting dates as early as I could in our research plots. just because that was sort of where farmers were gravitating towards. And I always invariably picked the wrong date by a couple of days. And so unfortunately, there were several times we had to replant several of our experimental plots. Same thing here. When you take a position and make a purchase, I suspect that few individuals last fall knew exactly where the commodity markets were going. We were starting to see that upward wave. We were certainly starting to see that in late October, early November. Many individuals had already taken positions at that point. So what did they see something in the market that were leading us to believe that we were going to see the types of commodity prices that we see today? I'm not sure that I saw it. I'm a terrible predictor unless I have really good data. Economic conditions change rather dramatically based upon weather patterns in South America. So I don't always see that as a clear indicator of what we're ultimately going to see in the commodity markets domestically. But those folks that took that position last fall when input prices were really low look like geniuses based upon the value of the crop that they're growing this spring. There's another question: if I apply over university recommendations and have my yield goal, could the final page show potentially how much I increase soil test level? We've actually tinkered with that. If you go to the website, it's not embedded in our model. But if you go to the website, and unfortunately it's only on the website, there's actually a tutorial that accompanies the tool. And it actually goes into how much can you actually change your soil test level. We have general rules of thumb, and take it for what it is. It's a general rule of thumb. My scare quotes, for those of you who are watching the video, on average, it's pretty good. But do realize that every soil is going to have a different conversion factor between if I oversupply. So let's just take phosphorus as an example. There are some soils, and this is some work out of University of Kentucky, I believe it was back in the 70s or 80s. If I oversupply by 20 pounds per acre, I can change my soil test unit by 1 part per million. Okay, so that 20 was the rule. Potassium, it's going to be much lower than that. It may be on the magnitude of 2 to 5. But recognize there's a range that is represented by the average. We do talk about that in the tutorial. It's not embedded in our model itself. I'm a little bit I'm not skeptical, but I'm a little bit timid to do that in the model. But if I have it available to you through the tutorial, I'm hopeful that that's another place that you can go to capture that information. And the reason I'm so afraid to do it is because when I say that 20 pound per acre, 1 part per million rule, that can vary dramatically depending upon type of soil test level. Those are the two main drivers of what's going to dictate what that conversion factor looks like. I'm afraid to embed that in my model. And the other challenge is I don't have access to enough data to share with me, okay, if you're talking about a clay loam soil that's growing, a clay loam soil that is growing 250 bushel corn, and my soil test level is 200, or let's say for phosphorus, my soil test level is 40 part per million. I don't have enough calibrated data to tell me what the calibration should look like to tell me what is that conversion factor. And I know that was a long-winded answer to that question. With the nutrient analysis function, are you able to input manure analysis? You could, but you're going to have a couple of values for that. Number one, your nutrient analysis is obviously going to be lower because it's a little bit more of a dilute source. You could certainly do that. The only thing that's going to change is you're going to have provide some estimate of cost associated with that. If you have access to that, you can, again, the way we've set it up, it's fully at your discretion as a user as to how you want to use the tool. So you could enter in manure nutrient analysis there. Just make sure you have an assumption for what the price of that material is. I'm going to go back to home. Great questions, by the way. So always appreciate the interaction. I hope I answered them well, well enough. I'm going to cancel that. I actually don't have the ability to change it to answered, so I'm going to leave that to Aaron. We've got 5 minutes left. Again, thank you for your attendance today. As you can probably tell, I'm fairly excited about these tools. It's not that they're new, but I really think that the user interface that the programmers have provided in developing this app makes for a much simpler environment for you as a user to access the tools that we have available. Hopefully that will lead to a lot of downloads, a lot of use. If you have ideas for functionality, use the Ask an Agronomist tab that we have available through our eKonomics website. We take all information, and in fact, just to give an illustration of how closely we follow what the recommendations are from users. We had a user out in California point out that there was some issues with our strawberry model, and there's a calculation error that we never caught. I don't know how we never caught it. It's probably because I never deal with strawberries. We resolved that issue in a couple of days. We're very responsive to the feedback that you provide, so please continue to provide that to us. We certainly appreciate it. The whole effort of these tools is to make you a better agronomist, to provide you as much information as we possibly can to help you make better decisions, whether you're a retail agronomist working with a farmer or you're a farmer making decisions with your agronomist or a consultant. It's all about availability of information. Continue to look at these tools because we're going to be updating these with some frequency, adding more functionalities. We're not going to do anything dramatic, but some of the things that I mentioned today, hopefully if we can get those done in the next year, I'll be very, very pleased. So keep coming back. We're going to keep adding as much functionality as we can based upon the availability of data. For those of you, this is my opportunity if you live in a state that's not represented by much in the way of data, and maybe you have the ear of a land-grant university scientist that works on nutrient response and some of these more obscure crops that we just don't have data for, punch them in the side and say, hey, you need to be publishing this somewhere. There's this guy out in Ohio that likes to mess with these models. And really what it really does is it promotes their agronomic response data and the models that they generate. We just couch it in an economic decision. That's something that's been our driving force for the economic side, is we're trying to put everything back to a dollars and cents basis, because farming is a business. If you're a retail agronomist, the farmer customer that you're servicing, he has to be profitable in order for you to be profitable. And we need our retail agronomists and our retailers, our customers, to be profitable so we can be profitable. So economics still matters. I appreciate the time this morning. Appreciate your attention. Put that feedback, ask the agronomist question through the eKonomics website. We will see you all in about a month when we provide another economics webinar offering. Take care, and I hope the growing season for everyone is going well. For those folks out west, I hope you're going to start getting some rainfall very, very soon. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.